So, what about the other Nordic countries? Both Denmark and Norway, like Sweden, have a king as their patron saint. And just like Saint Erik, they wanted to spread Christianity with the help of the sword. Let's turn our eyes to Norway, and perhaps the most famous of the Nordic patron saints, Saint Olav. His story is also the most well documented, as the entire second part of the Icelandic author Snorre Sturlasson's masterpiece Heimskringla, a book in 3 parts about the Norwegian kings, is about Olav. Olav was born in 995, son of Harald Grenske, who died the same year, and Åsta Gudbrandsdatter. She later remarried one of Norwegian's petty kings, Sigurd Styr, who is said to have been the great-great-grandson of the man who is usually called Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair. Olav is also said to have been part of that family. Olav is a historically verified person, but we must still keep in mind that his history was written down after his death. Heimskringla, for example, was written in the 13th century, so long after Olav's death. However, it is said to be based on old poems by Olav's contemporaries. According to these, Olav were only 12 years old when he first became a Viking, that is, sail across the seas to plunder. He is said to have been considered a king because of his royal descent, even though he had no country to rule. Most famous of his battles was his involvement in the struggle for the English crown. The Danish king Sven Forkbeard had conquered the country, and the English king Æthelred had fled. After Sven's death in 1014, he returned and offered payment for all who participated in the battle on his side. According to Heimskringla, Olav joined the battle on Æthelred's side, demolished London Bridge, and secured victory for Æthelred. He is said to have fought more battles for the English king and become one of his closest men. However, modern historians are skeptical of this version of events, as Olav is not mentioned in any contemporary English sources in connection with Æthelred, as he should have been if he was so important to the king. Many believe instead that he participated on the Danes' side. In 1015, he returned to Norway to make himself king there and free the country from the supremacy of the Danes. He wanted to reinstate Harald Fairhair's line on the Norwegian throne. He had the support of his mother and stepfather, and together they managed to persuade many of the Norwegian petty kings to rally behind him. He also gathered the people to himself and was elected king over all of Norway in 1015. After that, he is said to have set out to Christianize the country, often with his sword. But just like the story of Saint Erik, the legend ignores the fact that Norway was already largely Christianized. Olav's role in spreading Christianity in the country is therefore considered to have been considerably less than the legend made it out to be. Olav had long been in conflict with the Swedish king, Olof Skötkonung. The latter's daughter, Ingegerd, however, worked for peace between the countries and, against her father's wishes, became engaged to Olav. In the end, Olof Skötkonung agreed to peace, but he married Ingegerd to the Prince of Kiev, Yaroslav I. Olav had to settle for Ingegerd's little sister Astrid instead. They had a daughter together, Ulfhild. Olav's son Magnus, however, who would later be king of Norway, he had with the mistress. In 1028, the Danes returned to the country, and as Olav did not have the manpower to withstand them, he fled to his former betrothed Ingegerd in Novgorod. There are historians who believe that the two were in love with each other and even had a child together, but there is no evidence for this. He stayed in Novgorod for 2 years, until, with the help of his brother-in-law, King Anund Jakob of Sweden, he gathered an army and returned to Norway to reclaim the throne. He did not succeed, but fell in the Battle of Stiklestad. According to legend, Olav was wounded 3 times. First, he was stabbed in the thigh. Then he got a spear in the stomach, and finally a sword through the throat. After the first stab, he is said to have thrown away his sword, stopped fighting, and died a martyr's death. Even this battle, however, is debated. It is not mentioned in contemporary sources, but appears in literature first over 100 years later. Snorre Sturlasson mentions the works of poets who were contemporary with Olav, but they are not historically confirmed, and the poems have not survived, if they ever existed. The legend states that Olav was buried on the battlefield, and immediately rumors began to spread about miracles at the site. Again, Olav's stories has similarities with Saint Erik, since the first miracle was that a blind man who smeared his eyes with the king's blood regained his sight. Another proof of Olav's holiness was that when his body was exhumed a year later, it is said not to have decayed, but looked as it did on the day he died. Even the usual miracles happened when people prayed to or made pilgrimages to Olav's grave, which has now been moved to Nidaros Cathedral. However, even his final resting place is uncertain. Olav's story has yet another similarity to the Swedish Erik. It was his son who pushed for the canonization of his father. Magnus became king of both Norway and Denmark, and is known as Magnus the Good. Saint Olav is considered the first Nordic saint, and is still one of the most popular today. Unlike Erik and Saint Henrik, he has been canonized by the Pope, but this did not happen until 1888. There were plenty of warrior kings in the Viking and medieval Nordic countries. Another king who have managed to become a saint is King Knud IV of Denmark, known as Saint Knud. He was born about 1040, as the second oldest son of King Sven Estridsson. Sven was first Earl of Denmark under Saint Olav's son Magnus, who at the time were king of both Norway and Denmark. Sven's mother, Estrid, was the sister of Knut, or known as Canute the Great, who had been king of Denmark, Norway, and England. However, this great empire had long been dissolved when our Knut came to power in 1080, but he wanted to change that. Before becoming king, he had participated in 2 failed attempts to retake England, and when he became king, he wanted to try again. Knut was married to Adele, daughter of Robert I, Count of Flanders. The marriage had probably been arranged because both Denmark and Flanders had a common enemy in England, and Knut counted on the support of his father-in-law when he planned another campaign in 1085. Knut gathered the entire Danish fleet, consisting of up to 1,000 ships, to invade England. The fleet assembled in northern Jutland, but the king himself did not appear. The men grew increasingly impatient as the summer drew to a close. They needed to go home and take care of the harvest. The invasion of England would be postponed until the next spring. But that would never happen. The Danish nobles were dissatisfied with Knut, and in the spring of 1086 a rebellion broke out. Knut and his men fled and took shelter in a church in Odense. It did not save them, however, since all but one of them were killed. Knut himself is said to have been cut down with a spear or a lance in front of the high altar. Knut's widow, Adele, fled with their son Karl to her father in Flanders. On the way, she stopped at a church in Odense to take her husband's body with her. But when she came to collect the body, a bright light spread in the church, which she perceived as a miracle and therefore let Knut's body remain. Knut's brother Olav succeeded him on the Danish throne. Famine immediately broke out in Denmark, which was interpreted as God's punishment for Knut's murder. When Olav died a few years later, he was succeeded by yet another of Knut's brothers, Erik Eyegod. He immediately set to work to have Knut canonized, and in this he was helped by his sister-in-law Adele, who had contacts in Rome. In 1100 or 1101, Knut was canonized by the Pope. In the majority of the literature about Knud, he is described as a good and pious king, but there is one exception. In the Roskilde Chronicle from the middle of the 12th century, Knud is portrayed as a violent ruler who was killed because of unjust taxes. So, like his two saintly counterparts in Sweden and Norway, we have in Knud a warrior king who was murdered by political enemies, and whose surviving relatives and heirs did their best to encourage a cult around the deceased. All three were pious to the extent of donating money and patronage to the church, although historians believe that their role in spreading Christianity in the Nordics have been exaggerated in the legends. Presumably, they have rather become a kind of ideal of what a Christian king in the early Middle Ages should be like. The last Nordic national saint, however, is not a king, but a bishop. Torlak Thorhallsson was born in Iceland in 1133. His parents were Thorhall Thorlaksson and Halla Steindottir. They both came from noble families and were related to chieftains and other powerful nobles. It was his mother who early in Torlak's life inspired his love of learning. In the Icelandic bishop saga, he is described as a bright and eager to learn, and was praised for this by learned men. At the age of 15, he was ordained a deacon, and only a few years later a priest, which was unusual at such a young age. But he is described as young in age but mature in wisdom, humble, meticulous, and loved by all. In 1153, Torlak traveled to Paris to continue his studies, and then on to England. Around 1161, he returned to Iceland and was urged by family and friends to marry. In a dream, he had a vision of a man in fine clothes who told him not to marry, but to devote his life to God. This resulted in Torlak never marrying and being celibate, even though at this time it was not necessary for priests in Iceland. Torlak continued his career within the church. He was appointed prior, that is, head of a monastery, and later abbot. Around the same time, he began performing miracles. For example, it is said that when he read prayers over a burning house, the fire went out by itself, and he was able to cure both people and animals from diseases. However, he is said to have often come into conflict with worldly leaders in Iceland, as he tried to strengthen the church power at their expense. Among other things, he tried to forbid them from appointing priests to the churches they themselves built, but he had to give in because he had no real power to challenge them, nor did he want to use violence. Thus, it cannot be claimed that his church policy was particularly successful. Torlak had long suffered from poor health, and in 1186 he fell ill and finally died on December 23rd, age 60. However, the years differ between different sources. In the Bishop's Saga it says 1186, while in other sources it states that he'd have died in 1193. Regardless, more miracles immediately began to occur. Among other things, his body had been covered with several sores, which healed immediately after his death. And the usual, of course, sick people who were recovered when they prayed to Torlak. As mentioned earlier, the Catholic Church at this time did not have the exclusive rights to perform canonizations, and Torlak was the first and one of only two in the entire history of the Catholic Church to be canonized by decree of Parliament. Iceland's Parliament, Altinget, canonized Torlak on July 20, 1198. Almost 800 years later, this was confirmed by the then Pope John Paul II, who named Torlak the national saint of Iceland in 1984.